Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. Continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention, we're at the bottom of page 123 of the translation for those following along. Um, so, yeah, we're still in part 3 of the book. We're in section B of that part, and I believe subsection 3 of that section. So we're still talking about different kinds of memory images and like what role these images play in our intellectual life. So we looked at this sort of typology of memory images. So different people would have different sort of types of images in terms of which sense the images correspond to. So some people would have a visual memory or predominantly visual memory. They would visual images would be the most powerful, the most precise form of images that they experience, whereas other people would have primarily auditory images, so they would have memories of sounds would be predominant in their sort of mental life. So we went through a few different types, and then we looked at the mixed type, which would be sort of a combination of different types. But then after this typology bit, we looked at the question, or Simondon raises the question whether memory images are generic or particular. And this is a question that, it's on the one hand, it's just a purely sort of psychological question, like what is it, what properties do mental images have in the psychological life of human beings? But it's also tied up with questions about theory of knowledge, because you have alternate accounts of how knowledge comes about. Either you have sort of an empiricist kind of account where you say that you have all these particular images and there's a sort of continuity between a particular image and abstract knowledge or intellectual knowledge. So this account has a sort of summation or averaging explanation of how we come to have a concept. So you observe a pine tree one day, the next day you observe another pine tree, and so on. You observe 20 or 100 pine trees, and these images, these particular images, sort of combine with each other. They're added together or averaged out, or some sort of similar type of physical type process or quasi-physical process occurs that results in a generic image of a pine tree. So there's a continuity between the particular image that you see on one particular occasion and the general concept of a pine tree. So that's the sort of empiricist perspective on theory of knowledge. And then the alternate perspective is a kind of rationalist, or Simondon calls it idealist, perspective on theory of knowledge, which holds that there's a discontinuity between the particular images and the general concepts or knowledge in general. So this, we can think primarily here of Descartes and this distinction between the idea that we receive from experience. So, the pine trees that we observe, for example, and then these innate ideas that we don't receive through experience, that we, in some somewhat mysterious way, we have before we actually experience anything. So ideas of number, extension, and so on. These are ideas that we don't sort of abstract from experience, or learn to. We don't learn these concepts by observing a bunch of entities that have these properties. We have to have these ideas first before we can actually have any experience of these entities at all. So, and then one maybe surprising bit is that Simondon identifies Berkeley as falling under this rationalist side or idealist side, as opposed to the empiricist side. So in most histories of philosophy, Berkeley is identified as an empiricist. But for the purposes of this classification, what's important here is that Berkeley denies that there's any such thing as a general idea. So he says, if you imagine a man, you have to imagine your image of a man has to be either a tall man or a short man, with a certain hair color, a certain shape of nose and whatever. Every particular of that image has to be determinate, and he denies that there's such a thing as an abstract concept of man that would be neither short nor tall, neither brown or blonde hair or whatever, all these different properties would be undetermined in this image. He denies that there's any such image. And so what Berkeley is essentially stating here is that there's a gap between our between how these particular images operate in our mental life and then our capacity to use words for general concepts, a word like man and so on. So these have only a linguistic existence. There's a word man that we can apply to our particular images of men, but there's no sort of mental concept of man in general. So that's the bit about the sort of empiricist versus idealist positions in theory of knowledge. And then, so Simondon, as he typically does, he wants to sort of identify what is valid about each of these modes of reasoning or each of these different theories of knowledge. He's not going to say that one is correct and the other is incorrect. He wants to find out what sort of phenomena each one has grasped and then sort of identify how these two sort of opposed positions arise out of something more fundamental. And so he looks at the empiricist position, this sort of gradual or continuous development of general ideas out of particular images. He identifies this, or he sees this as corresponding to the development of living beings. So in the same way that an evolutionary lineage arises through branching, and there's a family and a genus and a species and so on, are ideas in the same way formed by branching. So you might, as an infant, might sort of form the concept of a tree first, and then through learning more about different types of trees or observing different types of trees and what properties these different trees have, comes to recognize, say, deciduous versus coniferous trees. Whether they actually use those precise words or not, but identifying two different types of trees and then maybe individual genera of trees and so on. So our development of concepts, our acquisition of concepts in our lifespan mirrors in some sense the evolutionary development of these living beings, that we sort of group beings in terms of families or lineages that correspond to the evolutionary development over time of these populations. And this is actually something that Simondon doesn't mention this, but just sort of incidentally, that there's been a fair amount of research by anthropologists into what's known as ethnobiology. So you have like ethnobotany, ethnozoology, and so on. And so this is looking at the different classifications of living beings that different people around the world have used. And often it turns out that people in a particular, New Guinea or a particular place identify very similar categories of living beings as contemporary scientific categorization, that they group the beings into species and genera, etc., that are fairly similar to the ones that are used by contemporary Western scientists looking at these living beings. So obviously, the traditional knowledge of people living in these areas is not the sort of social structure in which that knowledge arises is very different from Western scientific knowledge production, but there's a sort of convergence in terms of the hierarchy of concepts, the taxonomy of living beings that they arrive at, which is maybe some evidence for Simondon's point here that there's a sort of parallelism between the development of concepts in a human lifespan and the evolutionary development of living beings. And then he points out that this sort of classificatory knowledge applies well in the case of living beings because of this sort of branching structure of evolution. but it applies much less well to phenomena like geological phenomena, because here you don't have this sort of branching of populations. You instead have, for example, metamorphic processes. So a certain type of stone can turn into a different type of stone under particular temperature and pressure, etc. conditions. And so instead of having like a tree structure, you have sort of a network structure where one species can turn into a different species, for example. And this, again, in biology, is also a sort of conceptual problem in the case of classifying bacteria species, because you have, in the case of bacteria, there's what's known as lateral gene transfer, meaning that bacteria can exchange genetic material with each other. And so instead of having like a branching hierarchy of family and genera, species, etc., you have this sort of network structure where genes sort of pass from one direction to the other through these across branches of the hierarchy. So that's sort of, I think, as far as I know, a sort of open problem of how exactly to deal with this in biology, in the study of bacteria. So again, that's sort of Simondon's attempts to to identify which aspect of the world this classificatory thinking is grasping correctly. So this branching taxonomy of evolutionary lineages, and then sort of relativizing it, so to identify that it's very effective at one type of knowledge production, but then in other areas of knowledge it's much less effective. And so we're going to look at other types of reasoning and formation of concepts, and how where these other types of knowledge production are effective. That's what we're going to look at. I think the rest of this section today. Okay, so let's start with the text. If I can get a volunteer to read from bottom of 123.
I can read. Do you know where are we at this? We should also note.
I think we may have read that. I think we're at finally we anticipate.
Okay. Finally, we can anticipate the processes for the saturation of the image and the formation of the symbol on the basis of this conception of the constitution of the memory image, which proceeds by the branching out of successive imprints from a common and primitive trunk, which ultimately stems from the first imprint that founded the class. A quote-unquote tree of memory images that developed from a first imprint tends to become a symbol when the opposite tendencies of subsequent imprints bring the primitively asymmetrical structure, the bad mother as aberrant case of the primitive mother, into a state of symmetry in which the image is a coupling of the incompatible qualities which are nonetheless linked together, the mother that is both good and bad, nurturing and possessive, source of life and threat of absorption, negating the child individual. This coupling of incompatible yet linked qualities expresses the state of supersaturation of the memory image, a metastable state that is the necessary condition for invention, that is, for a structural change restoring compatibility within a new system. The image, having become a symbol, condenses a contradictory experience. It presents itself in this form with the opacity of a real object that is irreducible to any quote-unquote attitude of consciousness, and partially refractory even to an elucidation by consciousness. The symbol image yokes the subject to events of which it retains a complex memory, and makes the subject depend on these events, of which it preserves a real and representative fragment that is the equivalent to the object as concrete and to the enveloping situations. Conversely, the symbol opens a path towards the object in the sense that it is a means for conjuring it, restoring it out of traces. And traces are effective in conjuring the object when all the various aspects of the object are simultaneously represented within the imprinting system concerning that object, with an inner equilibrium that constitutes both the coherence and at the same time the tension of the system. Thus, in order for the memory image to evolve to the point of becoming a symbol, it must condense an intense and heightened experience energetically tying the living being to its milieu, and it must develop through a series of qualitatively different and successive imprints irreducible to one another. It is the heterogeneity of imprints linked to a same source that gives to the symbol its inner tension and renders it different from a totalization comparable to that of a composite portrait. I'm not arguing that the hypothesis of the constitution of generic images through a process of totalization does not account for a number of processes. Totalization may occur in cases where no imprinting exists. That is, in cases where the acquisition of memories takes place through relatively weak motivations and remains close to the functioning of immediate memory. However, distant memories that are strongly emotionally heightened, but also relatively information poor, do not wait for all the successive and partial snapshots to take place before finding their organization. To extend this photographic metaphor, we might say that the action of the developer occurs after each contribution of experience, and that memory, rather than remaining in a state of latent organization until the series end, is corrected and amended with each new contribution of an intense experience, and is supercharged by successive imprints that consequently form a series in which new contributions may clash with older contributions without erasing them. So yeah, this is a very interesting couple of paragraphs, and this seems like maybe the most direct reference to Simondon's theory of ontogenesis, maybe, that we've encountered so far in the book, although I may be misremembering. But this idea that a memory image can become, or can rise to this, I guess, threshold of a symbol image when you have a metastable disparation of at least partially contradictory images of the same object, which contradiction is, he suggests here, is resolved or encompassed in a higher dimension in Invention. This sounds a lot like, for instance, the genesis of three-dimensional vision out of monocular retinal images, which he gives as an example of individuation in part 1 of Individuation.
Yeah, I think that's right. We'll see more about, like, he's sort of transitioning now from the memory image to the symbol as a particular type of image, which is the subject of the next part, part C of this, or section C of this part. So yeah, he talks about how it's interesting here that he talks about contradiction, because in individuation he denies, like, when he sort of differentiates his account of ontogenesis from what he takes the dialectical account to be. He denies that contradiction is sort of the core of this differentiation that is the precondition for ontogenesis. So he, like, in the case of disparation of retinal images, he of course, there's no, like, contradiction between two retinal images in a logical sense. They're just two light patterns that are different from each other. So that, if we take that disparation as the model, then we would say that contradiction is not the motor of this process of ontogenesis. But here he explicitly does mention contradiction, the mother as both good mother and bad mother at the same time, or as containing both aspects at the same time. So yeah, maybe this, I don't know, this might be a little bit more on the side of the dialectical aspect of Simondon that we've identified in a few cases, where he, even though he explicitly sort of denies that what he's doing is dialectics, there are passages that seem much more dialectical. So maybe this is one that we could sort of add to that column on the chart. So he's identifying. He said that this process of formation of a symbol is distinct from the process of forming a general image through something like a composite photograph. So this is the first case that I mentioned in the summary at the beginning. The sort of empiricist case that involves a continuity between the particular image and the general idea. So he doesn't deny that is a possible way of forming a concept, but he's distinguishing this process of forming a symbol from that process. He thinks that this is a more particular, the symbol formation is something different and somewhat more complicated than this sort of basic formation of a general idea by summation or averaging. And then he gives this somewhat obscure metaphor in terms of photography. So he says, so this composite photograph metaphor, so this idea that the formation of general ideas is comparable to a composite photograph. He says if we want to sort of keep this image of photography, we would have to take it that in the formation of a symbol, instead of having just a bunch of images on a plate that average out or sum together to form a composite image, we would have to take it that the development of the image occurs after each exposure, but then each image is sort of formed as a whole. It doesn't like average with the other images, but then that image is constantly evolving over time. So our sort of symbolic cognition of objects is not fixed. We don't form like a fixed symbol that would be sort of maintained through the rest of our lifespan. We instead have anything that we can grasp symbolically is subject to further enrichment or further development over the course of our life history. So again, we'll see more about what symbolic cognition consists in the next part or the next section of this part. But I think if we think of something like our grasp of a personality of a person who is close to us, a family member, a partner, a close friend, or something like that, we have like I guess a basic image of what that person is like. Like you can sort of predict what a person, if you know the person well, you can predict what they would do in a certain situation, or you recognize certain habits or quirks or whatever of that person. So these are sort of basic images, but our sense of that person's personality is more than just sort of a list of traits or a set of predictions of how they would react in a particular situation. We have a sort of total grasp of that person's personality, and it's on the basis of that grasp of personality, which we could take to be sort of symbolic cognition. It's on the basis of that we sort of carry out our predictions of how they would react in different situations. So yeah, I think maybe that example will help to clarify what kind of symbolic cognition he's talking about here. Because, and again, our knowledge of a person's personality is something that isn't fixed, but it evolves over time. The person, their personality changes, and in particular, our relationship with that person sort of feeds back into their personality, and their that person will evolve over time in relation to me, and then also as we live with a person or go through experiences together with that person, we come to know them in a deeper or more full sense than we did before. So this symbolic cognition is constantly evolving over the life of a person, and it's not something fixed.
It seems like these intense experiences that he says give rise to, I guess, like determinative aspects of the symbol image. So they have to arise from a tense system of subject and milieu, but he says that they're also sort of refractory of the initial experience. So they sort of encode it and distort it at the same time. And at least that's my understanding of the second part of this first paragraph, is that it's difficult for the subject to get back to, maybe because of the contradictory nature of this symbol image, to get back to any one of the impressions and kind of see it for what it is.
Yeah, I think like again, if we think of the example of like a person knowing a person, a partner or a family member or something, are like, again, if someone asks you like what is this person's personality, or like how would you describe this person, you might list like a few sort of traits of that person, habits or things like that, but that sort of list of traits is nowhere, doesn't come close to exhausting the the concept or the symbol that you have of that person's personality, and it's something that's very difficult to put into words. Like this is why being a novelist or a poet or something like that is a very difficult, or a good one, of course, is very difficult. Like someone who is able to use in a few words sort of depict a personality and make that person seem sort of living to the reader, that's a skill that is very difficult to acquire. And so most of us, if we're asked to describe, what is your partner's personality, what is your parents' personality, etc., we have like, a few sort of stock phrases or a few, we might describe a few different habits that they have, but it's a very poor approximation to the symbolic concept. Or the symbolic cognition of that person, I guess you could say. And so these like intense experiences that you have, going through life with a person, you might sort of think back to those experiences years later and sort of discover a different aspect that you never noticed before of that situation. You might realize that this person was acting in a different way than you thought they were at the time, or that their actions sort of shed light on their personality in a way that you hadn't realized before, etc. So you can always sort of go back to those experiences and learn more from them than you sort of noticed originally. So it's not, these experiences are not sort of transparent to consciousness, to our experience of ourselves and of the world. We can't just sort of read off from the experience what properties this person has. We have to think over it and live through our recollection of those experiences to get more and more out of it, but we can never fully exhaust that experience.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking ahead to the section where he'll talk about Lacan, but I wonder if he has something like a psychoanalytic approach to the attempt to understand the symbol image in mind. I mean, he is obviously talking about like psychoanalytic themes such as the bad mother or the sort of original or primitive good mother already. But that may be one way to, one way to think of the refractory nature of the symbol image is that these sort of constitutive events and memories of people that we have are not immediately apparent to us and sort of need to be worked through carefully in order to understand what they were.
Yeah, I think he's definitely thinking of psychoanalysis when he's writing this bit. I think though he has a sort of ambiguous relationship to psychoanalysis. We saw this in Individuation, where he sort of wants to substitute for the concept of the unconscious this notion of the subconscious, and he had some critical comments about Freud, and then in other places he seems to be more interested in Jung than in Freud. So yeah, his relationship to psychoanalysis, I think, is a complicated one. That I'm not sure. I haven't seen any secondary literature like on that specific topic, so that would be an interesting project if anyone is interested in pursuing that. I think what he's at least taking from psychoanalysis here is this idea that that you have to sort of work through an experience, that these sort of key experiences in your life, these formations of symbols, are not transparent to us, and that we have to work through. And it takes work and a sort of process and experience to actually grasp what has happened to us and what we've gone through and what we've experienced. So I think that's sort of the core idea that he's taking from psychoanalysis here, but he's giving it a very different spin, of course, than like Freud might have. And we'll see his comments on Lacan later on as well. Okay, do we have a volunteer to read this last paragraph of the section? Okay, if not, then I can read it. Okay, I'll read this one, and then we can hopefully someone else can jump in for the following section. Okay. Lastly, the totalizing process described by Taine, Huxley, Ribot may exist within the progressive constitution of the image as it progresses towards the state of symbol. After the main dichotomies have taken place, experiences that are homogeneous in relation to each other within one of the dichotomies' paths may overlap and thus partially erase their historical individuality. The list of a person's good deeds on the one hand and bad deeds on the other opens the register of two separate generic totalizing images. If good and bad deeds interfered in a single regime, they would erase each other. Yet the image of a person with a long list of good deeds and an equally long list of bad deeds is not at all the same as that of a person that does neither bad nor good and remains perpetually neutral. In order for totalizing to occur, previous dichotomies constituting the classes of totalization must have taken place in a more implicit and primitive mode of memory, which corresponds to imprinting. The processes described by empirical theory correspond to partial memories. The image is anterior to the distribution of tasks among these partial memories. In the course of experience, the progressive transition from image to symbol happens through the interactions of these partial memories. The image is anterior to partial empiricisms and is developed by going further than their results. So this, again, is part of the transition from the memory image to the symbol. But Simondon gives an argument here against the idea that this empiricist conception of image formation as a sort of summation or averaging is sort of sufficient to account for our images. And so he uses this person example that I was trying to develop a little bit earlier. So he says, if you take a person who has done a bunch of good things and a bunch of bad things, and if we took it that these different actions sort of summed up against each other, they would just sort of cancel each other out, and this person would be the same as a person who had done nothing sort of notable, either good or bad. But this doesn't really seem to be correct. I think we are capable of recognizing, a person who has done notably good and notably bad things as distinct from a person who has done nothing notable at all. We sort of make a distinction between these two types of cases, which doesn't seem to be it's hard to explain how we make this distinction using the purely empiricist approach to concept formation. So what Simondon argues here is that this image formation is prior to this sort of summation process, and the summation process is a sort of partial image formation. These are partial memories, so we might have a partial memory of a person. We have a memory of the good deeds that a person did, and then we have a different memory of the bad deeds that the person did, and these are sort of partial memories, but the image of the person as a whole, this is a sort of symbol that is prior to either the good deeds or the bad deeds. And that's how we sort of distinguish between this person who has done lots of good and lots of bad, and then the other person who has done nothing notable either way. This is sort of the transition to the symbol is recognizing that a purely empiricist account of concept formation has a hard time accounting for the sort of non-neutralization of good versus bad, or different qualities that a person might have. Angus, do you want to explain this Buddhist concept that you put in the chat here?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I think I saw like a statue of this character in a museum, and the description stuck with me, but it was a sort of a ruthless highwayman who converted to Buddhism and became like a holy man. But that seemed like a good example of the kind of image that can't be understood in terms of like the averaging of good and bad deeds, because there's something striking about the transformation that's not, it's, if you just like add the good stuff and subtract the bad stuff, it would be kind of an average life, which is not really what it is.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example. And maybe we can connect this with the concept of conversion that he talked about in individuation, and then again in history of the individual, or history of the notion of the individual. This concept that that you, in the process of individuation of psychic individuation, the process through which you become the person that you are, there's these sort of key moments of conversion that are sort of irreversible, and sort of these discrete moments of individuation as opposed to the sort of continuous development. So this, I think, this personality is a kind of indication that we don't form our concepts just by summation or averaging. There has to be something, another principle of concept formation distinct from this sort of purely summative concept formation that the empiricist conception focuses on. Okay, so let's go on to the next section on where we talk about the symbol specifically. So let's see if I can get a volunteer to read, up to the subsection heading, I think, up to where it says subsection 1. Let's start with that, if I can get a volunteer.
I can read again if nobody else can.
Sure.
Section C, the imaginary is organized world, effigies and symbol objects. The memory image in the perspective sketched above may then have the properties of a generic image, even of several generic images in a relation of interaction, without having to constitute the source of information as a plurality of individuals of a given class. It may be an individual, a plurality of individuals making up a family, an ethnic group, or a nation. This is why the development of the image towards the symbol operates in the same way, whether the image is of a single person or a group. Knowledge through the image melds the individual and the group. The image of the English, of the American, or the Italian for a given individual has a mental content analogous to the image of a person. The generic dimension of the image's reach disappears once the image is constituted. Hence, knowledge according to images gives rise to the possible substitution of an individual by another as a substrate for responsibility, hostages, etc. The tendency of the symbol to develop through action reveals the internal tension contained in a grouping of divergent characteristics. But this action may either express itself directly without an intermediary construction through attitudes and conducts, or use the body as an intermediary object, imitation, expressive mimicry, or else recruit or even construct new objects as analogs of the reality represented by the image. Yeah, I'm not sure what he's saying in that first paragraph, other than that the symbol image can be a symbol image of groups of people as opposed to individuals of sort of various levels of abstraction.
So I think in that first bit he's talking about the memory image. So he's sort of introducing the symbol image by contrast with what we've seen before. And so what he's talking about here is the way that a memory image. So your image of a person, your memory image of a person, and your memory image of, say, an ethnic group or whatever, are formed in the same way through this sort of summation or averaging process. This quasi-physical process of just sort of assembling images and abstracting away from the details. And so he suggests here that it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about your memory image of a person, an individual person, or your memory image of a group of people. You sort of form these like stereotype images in the same way. It's the same sort of process of concept formation either way, or image formation. And yeah, there's interesting bit here that he just puts it sort of in a parenthesis, but when he talks about hostages, and so here I think maybe what he's thinking of is this notion of collective punishment, which is recognized as a war crime, where you have country A or army A attacks the people of army that belong to the same ethnic group or the same nation as Army B, and they punish the civilian population for something that the army or an armed group of some kind that comes from that population has done. So yeah, here, because there's this sort of you're operating using these sorts of stereotype memory images. So one person from ethnic group A is just as good as any other person from ethnic group A in terms of like punishing someone for the supposed crime that they've committed. So yeah, that's sort of an interesting application of this concept of a memory image, that we can sort of substitute someone from a particular group as responsible for some action that another person in that group might have committed. And then this last paragraph, just sort of leading into the next subsection, is pretty obscure. I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about here, but so he talks about this internal tension, and so I think what he's thinking of here is when you do form these images of a stereotype image of a group, you of course are leaving out all kinds of other aspects. If you have a stereotype of Italians are are like X or whatever, you are sort of leaving out all kinds of other properties of Italians who may not be like X or that have other properties that are contradictory with with each other and so on. And so there's the sort of tension that sort of pushes towards a formation of a symbol as something more as a richer image than this memory image that just sort of abstracts away from the details. So I think maybe that's what he has in mind. But then he suggests here, and I think we'll see more on this as we keep reading this part or this section, that this formation of a symbol has to do with action in some sort of intrinsic way. So it's not just that we form a symbol in our minds and sort of contemplate this symbol passively. The symbol formation process has this sort of intrinsic drive to express itself. That could be in the formation of an art object, for example, or it could be performing an action in practical life of some kind. But in general, there's a sort of expression of the symbol through action, or symbol formation is something that is active as opposed to contemplative. So I think we'll see more on what exactly that means as we go through the rest of this section. Okay. Do we have any volunteers to read the next page or so of this subsection? Okay, so I'll go for this one. Seems like it's just the two of us who are reading today. That's okay. But I'll read this bit. Okay, subsection 1. The notion of the imago. In what way the imago is a symbol? For Lacan, imago is the name given to a paradoxical entity, an unconscious representation that lies below the complex and constitutes one of the organizers of psychic development. Volume 8 of the Encyclopédie Française. The imago organizes images and thoughts. It accounts for attitudes displaying the nexus of contradictory forces any complex is made of, and is thus the basis of certain structures in which the complex is a concrete factor. That is, for example, and especially, the imago of the maternal breast, which is at the basis of the weaning complex. The original situation of the child is a relation of extreme dependency on the mother. Weaning corresponds to the birth of autonomy, bringing new satisfactions, but also a loss of security and the satisfactions linked to dependency. To echo expressions used above, we might say that a dichotomy occurs when the possibility of autonomy comes to be grafted onto the primitive relation to the mother. So long as the possibility of autonomy remains symmetrical, occasional, and truly marginal with respect to the relation to the mother, does not create an imago. The imago is produced as a figure of tensed equilibrium which, revisiting the absolutely primary character of the relation to the mother, places that relation on the same plane and at the same level as independence. The imago is a figure of equilibrium that renders independence and the relation to the mother symmetrical by transforming their relation after the fact, by reconsidering their relation as a dependency now felt as a threat, and with the danger of absorption, return to intrauterine existence. The unconscious representation that is the imago of the maternal breast corresponds to the simultaneous duality of the narrow relation to the mother as object of aspiration, and of the wish for emancipation corresponding to the personal development of the child. The tense simultaneity of this divergent pair of aspirations is symbolically expressed in a death wish, linked to precocious forms of ties with others. The mother is represented as the kind of resting place of nirvana, of a renunciation of separated individuality. See Ms. Favet-Boutonier's course on l'imagination, pages 88 to 89. The imago thus brings together, in a tense and symmetrical equilibrium, two situations which, in fact, manifested themselves in succession in their full expression, and in an asymmetrical way. The imago is a symbol because it refers to a reality other than that of the ego, and it is able to refer to the other reality because instead of summarizing and linearly condensing successive experiences, it concretizes and condenses them into a paradoxical entity that is the disclosure within the ego of the real relation with others as a source of alterity. The symbol induces thoughts, images, and attitudes that reach others in an ambivalent way. The duality or ambivalence of the imago expresses the real duality of the other and the subject because it summarizes the changes of situation triggered by the development of the subject in its relationship to a single person. The maternal imago is the union in a simultaneous couple of the two successive perspectives of the relation to the mother from the point of view of the child. The imago is a symbol because it points back to the object through the whole gamut of its possible manifestations, contained within the extreme terms of the imago. Here, the mother as source of subsistence, and the mother as annihilation of the child's individuality. The imago as a tension between these extreme terms virtually contains the spectrum of all possible situations with respect to a given person. It is in advance the exhaustive summary of concrete relations and thus represents a mode of access to symbolized reality on the part of the subject. The imago is not merely the summary of what is experienced. It marks the beginning of reversibility toward action. Right, so this is, I think, a little bit difficult to understand exactly what's going on here. I guess sort of the basic idea is that in the relation to the mother, the child goes through two distinct stages in the weaning complex, as he calls it here. So there's the breastfeeding stage where the child is sort of united with the mother and experiences this union with the mother as pleasurable. And then after separation, there's this sort of valorization of independence instead. Of course, there's a sort of transition period where the mother's refusal to breastfeed is sort of experienced as a punishment or as a sort of bad mother who is refusing to provide what the child needs. But then after this weaning has occurred, the sort of prior experience of the mother, of the union with the mother, is now experienced as a kind of aggression, as a kind of consumption of the child by the mother. So this sort of what was before an experience of pleasurable connection to the mother and union with the mother is now experienced as a sort of hostile, threatening experience, a kind of threatening image of the mother as aggressive and threatening to consume the child. And so the imago, this sort of image that forms after the weaning process, combines these two contradictory images of the mother into one, so in one sort of symbol. And so again, this is this process of forming a symbol out of a contradictory situation that he described in the previous bit that we just read. So again, this is sort of a kind of process of forming this contradictory image, and here he's borrowing the psychoanalytic term imago as to describe this image that refers to these two contradictory aspects of the mother.
Yeah, I don't really know very much about Lacan, but it's interesting that the symbol of the imago is sort of anticipates all relation with other people, so that he says that the imago is tension between these extreme terms of, I guess, these two aspects of the mother contains the spectrum of all possible situations with respect to a given person. I assume that means just other people in general. So it's sort of like any interaction that you'll have with other people or anticipation of interactions will fall somewhere between these two extremes formed by this, the initial relation with the mother as kind of the first other person.
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, this is sort of a typical Simondon kind of move here, where he's setting up a sort of spectrum with these two poles. So we have these two images of the mother as the poles of this tension, and then every other sort of relation to a person is going to fit somewhere in between those two poles. And so I think that's what's going on here. So this relation to the mother is sort of sets up the child's relationships to other people throughout his life, insofar as those relationships will find a position somewhere along this spectrum with the two images of the mother at each pole.
I was a little bit surprised that Simondon was reading Lacan. It doesn't really seem like his. I guess it's not surprising in the sense that Simondon seemed kind of interested in everything, but he certainly seems more kind of, science oriented, I guess, and as you noted earlier, not particularly sympathetic to psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I think this might be the only explicit reference to Lacan in Simondon. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think, Lacan was fairly well known at the time. His so this is written simultaneously with Lacan's seminars that are now published and translated in the late 50s, early 60s. So yeah, Lacan was already well known. These seminars were sort of famous in the Parisian intellectual scene. So yeah, it makes sense that Simondon would have had some awareness of what Lacan was doing. But yeah, it is. I mean, there's definitely a big intellectual divergence between the two in terms of like how they approach, working through a problem and presenting their work and so on. What sort of sources they use and pretty much everything about them is sort of opposed to each other, I think. So yeah, it is somewhat surprising, and then it's also somewhat surprising here that he seems to be largely positive about Lacan's work here. He doesn't have he doesn't have a lot to say in sort of criticism of Lacan or of psychoanalysis in this bit, but then he's going to go on to talk about more sort of mythological symbols that are more Jungian in form than sort of classical Freudian psychoanalysis. So yeah, again, it's this weird sort of ambiguous relationship with psychoanalysis where he's obviously interested in what psychoanalysts have to say, but he's I think maybe hesitant to sort of accept fully what psychoanalysis is doing. But yeah, it's an interesting topic that I have not really looked into in a lot of detail. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. Seems like Angus, you're up. It's just us so far that have been reading.
Yes, no problem, unless somebody else wants to jump in and read. Okay, I'll go ahead. Okay, sorry, we're at the bottom of 128.
The top of 128.
Top of 128, okay. Lacan cites other complexes in their corresponding imago. The alter ego corresponds to the complex of intrusion, which is at once a highly attractive replica of the ego and a rival, and then there is the Oedipus complex. In Lacan's view, there is a difference between the image and the symbol, the latter appearing at the level of complexes where we find three terms. The Oedipus complex, whereas images express the duality of persons. However, even if we must admit that the reality of the symbol is more complex than that of the image, the imago as organizer is already an elementary symbol, since it contains in representation, whether conscious or non-conscious, a gamut of possibilities rendering it capable of corresponding to all real situations of a relationship to a reality, the mother, the intruder, etc. Thanks to the duality of extreme terms, the imago deploys a wide spectrum of possible relations marked by situations actually experienced. The imago is a symbol because it allows the passage from the discontinuous spectrum of ahistorical experience to the continuous spectrum of possibilities contained between antithetical extreme terms. It condenses and reorders experience to make it into a universal mode of access to a given reality. It formalizes the random series of imprints. Yet there does not appear to be a difference in nature between a primary type of formalization, such as that of the spectrum of qualities and attitudes between the two opposite extreme terms, such as life and death, dependence and autonomy, and a more complex formalization mobilizing a ternary structure, such as that of the Oedipus complex. A binary formalization simply opens up a wider set for the interpretation of experience than a ternary formalization. The binary mode corresponds to the temporal succession of the heterogeneity of attitudes and relations within a changing situation, while the ternary formalization implies an objective simultaneity and a plurality in the field of objects. For instance, mother and father simultaneously present in relation to the child and to each other as a couple, while individually relating to the child. The more elementary a formalization, the more experiences it can host. The bipolar relation between life and death envelops everything, can contain everything, since it sets the extreme terms of experience. maybe I'll stop there. The next paragraph is pretty long. So it seems like, okay, the difference between an image and a symbol for Lacan is that the image has 2 terms, whereas a symbol has 3 terms. And so I guess the Oedipus complex is paradigmatic for the symbol because obviously there are 3 terms in the Oedipus complex. But Simondon wants to argue that the fact that an image has only 2 terms actually gives it a wider range of possible deployment, because if these 2 terms are like contradictory extremes, then, obviously, like by the principle of non-contradiction, they would kind of cover everything. Like either a person is a good person or they are not a good person, or either a person is an intruder or not an intruder. I don't really understand how it seems like both of these kinds of, both the image and the symbol can be symbols in Simondon's sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I just said that Simondon doesn't seem to criticize Lacan, but here he is, I think, making at least a modification of Lacan's terminology. So he wants to, so where Lacan distinguishes between an image and a symbol, as you pointed out, in terms of the number of terms that go into constructing this mental formation. Simondon wants to say that there's a continuity from one to the other, and so we should use the term symbol to cover images in Lacan's sense and symbols in Lacan's sense. So we shouldn't make some sort of distinction of kind between these 2-term images and then the 3-term symbols. We should see them as continuous with each other. So it's a sort of difference of complexity, and then that complexity sort of has the result of restricting the number of situations that fall under that symbol. So something, this binary opposition like life and death, is something you can sort of apply to pretty much any situation. So you can think, for example, of like the yin and yang opposition, which sort of covers every possible pair of opposites that the sort of 2 principles are sort of universal oppositions. And so I think these sorts of binary oppositions for Simondon are, because of their simplicity, they can apply to pretty much any situation. Whereas these more complex ones, like the Oedipus complex, that have 3 or maybe more terms in other symbols, because they're more complex, it means that fewer situations will fall under them, or will be applicable, or this symbol will be applicable to fewer situations. So yeah, that's partly, I think, just a terminology question of like whether you want to use the symbol for the more restricted case where there's 3 or more terms, or you want to use the symbol for all cases, including the ones that have only 2 terms. But I think maybe more importantly than just terminology, the question is whether there's a sort of continuity from the 2-term case to the 3-term case, or whether there's a sort of qualitative difference between these 2 cases. And so Simondon says there's a continuity, whereas Lacan holds that there's a qualitative distinction. So yeah, I think that's more or less what the argument of this paragraph is. Yeah, so it's not, again, it's a little bit difficult because I don't actually know this article of Lacan that he's working with here from the encyclopedia. So I'm not 100% sure, what arguments of Lacan he's opposing here. But yeah, I think that's what's going on in this bit, is a terminology distinction from Lacan that sort of follows from this difference in terms of continuity versus discontinuity between the simple and the complex cases of symbolization. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read. Of course, it might seem odd to consider primary modes of thought as formalizations. However, we are indeed dealing with a formalization when it is a question of the images and symbols that make up the common background of a culture, especially from the perspective of Mircea Eliade's work. He roughly reprises Jung's idea of the archetype as a schema of the imagination, a mold for images belonging to humanity's past, perhaps even pre-human stages in the becoming of the species. For Eliade, the symbol is foremost religious, while images refer to individual existence. Such a distinction all but amounts to saying that images are more primitive than symbols. symbols formalizing certain kinds of imprints involving not only the formalization of the variations of the relation to others along a continuous spectrum, but the actual presence of a tertium quid, the father, the law, society, nature, etc., which cannot be formalized by the simple polarity of a continuous qualitative spectrum, but requires at least a ternary structure. Indeed, ternary structures allow individuals of the same group to communicate, since they formalize the interactive experience and provide a terrain of universality corresponding to an intellectualized, adult, vigilant, conscious expression. But binary structures also allow communication according to less universally collective modalities, less well inserted into the action of the group, and implying a lower degree of vigilance. Fairy tales and myths sometimes display binary structures: the ogress, the stepmother, wealth and poverty, pride and humility, the oscillations of a nemesis. Finally, within a given culture, there is a certain linkage that connects individual binary structures to ternary structures that presuppose the presence of society, law, or divinity. This is the case in particular of individual salvation in a religion. The dichotomy of an individual life and death is reframed within a supernatural context where it is a question of everlasting life and death. The conversion of a binary into a ternary structure is made possible by an intermediary structure: sacred, profane, creature, creator, temporal, eternal. That is, one might say, a dual inlet, since it is a dichotomy only at one of its extreme terms, that of the relation with the ego, but it participates in a more complex structure from the point of view of the privileged term, the sacred, the creator, the eternal, which is superior and anterior to the other. Such retrofitting structures act equally as structures of conversion. Ethical religious actions of passage and of the transformation of the self, like sacrifice, can receive their formalization only through such conversion structures between binary and more complex forms. I'll go on and read the rest of this. Whatever its reach then, the memory image can already receive a formalization, even when it concerns the sole individual or their very primitive relation to the parent. It might be better to speak of a binary symbol or a ternary symbol rather than of an image in the former case and symbol in the latter. For there is a symbol as soon as there is a formalization of imprints. If binary symbols were not formed, would it even be possible to acquire the ternary symbols allowing communication with others in a universal mode? The world of the individual imaginary prepares access to the register usually called symbolic. The individual imaginary reflects the universal conditions of existence, since it expresses life and death, health and sickness, joy and sadness, pleasure and pain. The register of the individual is binary, yet it includes a formalization of experiences, a symmetrization of imprints, and thereby a symbolic power. In the imaginary, Sartre denies any distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic function. They are both forms of unreflective thought, aiming at the possession of the object. While Sartre's definition of the imaging consciousness is debatable, his interpretation is extremely interesting because it emphasizes a relation of existence and of action between the object and the subject, one woven in images and symbols rather than, as in most other doctrines, including Husserl's, relations of signification which, to a greater or lesser degree, associate images and symbols with signs. Finally, we should point out the theory of Piaget, who, in La formation du symbole chez l'enfant, connects the distinction between image and symbol to his distinction between functions of accommodation and functions of assimilation. Yet there already exists in the image a constructive activity which entails that it is not simply an extension of perception. Quote, the pure image, l'image simple, is an interiorized imitation of the object it relates to, just as an exterior imitation is a direct copy of the model by means of the subject's own body or of actions that result in a material reproduction of the model, drawing or construction. End quote. The distinction between simple image and symbol corresponds to access at the level of representation. When images let affective correspondence be established among them, the passage to the symbolic level takes place. Play, in particular, uses symbols that manifest affectivity, intentions, or desires. Later, symbols, stabilized by conventions, especially language, effect a transition towards concepts. The specificity of the symbolic function lies in the connection between signifiers and signifieds. According to Piaget, this function only truly appears at the stage when play allows for the assimilation of the real into the ego, as dreams do, and bestows signification. Piaget's theory, while maintaining the distinction between image and symbol within a genetic perspective, does not exclude the possibility of forms of transition between image and symbol, images being more primitive than symbols. What we would like to say is that a truly implicit formalization of images takes place according to the simplest dimensions, corresponding to individual life, that is, in the form of a continuous spectrum of the binary type that permits correspondences. Such a formalization already bestows on images a symbolic signification and reach. Right, so he's again here talking about this continuity between the binary case and the ternary case. So he's talking about these various authors, Iliad, Piaget, who make an opposition between the binary and the ternary case, and he is instead opting for Sartre's argument that that the binary and ternary cases are continuous with each other. Yeah, he takes it that this what he calls here the individual imaginary. So this binary, this set of binary oppositions in which the individual operates is sort of the preliminary stage of the symbolic, or is the sort of most basic form of the symbolic. That we have to recognize a continuity between the binary and the ternary cases because the one sort of passes into the other. So he gives this sort of complicated, and I don't entirely understand this explanation in relation to Eliade's, talk about symbols in folk tales and legends and myths and so on. That there's a sort of relationship between a binary and a ternary structure. So I'm not sure exactly how that works because I don't know Eliade's work at all. But yeah, in general, he's pointing to a continuity between binary and ternary uh, forms of symbolization, and he again makes use of this notion of conversion here in on page 129. So this, I think, sort of confirms what we were talking about earlier with this Buddhist personality who undergoes this conversion process. So yeah, I think conversion is an important point to keep in mind here. This idea of conversion is of course a binary concept. You start off in one state and then you end up in a different state that's opposed to the first one. But it sort of acquires its force by connecting with more complicated concepts that you're not just converting from A to B. You're converting into a whole system, a whole network of concepts and images and symbols that forms, say, a religious tradition. Like when you become Christian or you become Buddhist or whatever, you are converting. You're sort of turning into you're inserting yourself into this complicated network of symbols that pre-exists your conversion process.
Maybe he seems to say a couple of times that these binary structures there's like a continuity between the two poles of the binary, and maybe in the ternary structure it's the discontinuity between the terms that requires the third term, so they need to be like equal or convertible in something else, like in a larger set that allows you to change from one to the other, as opposed to the binary term that, because of its continuity, needs no like overarching set.
Yeah, I think that's partly right. I think there's maybe one point I would. So yeah, I'll start with what I think is right about that. I think you're right to point to this difference between the binary and the ternary processes. The binary one, as you said, he described it in terms of a continuity. So this sort of spectrum, like the good mother and the bad mother, and then all our relationships to other people, sort of are positioned somewhere on the spectrum between the good mother and the bad mother. So yeah, that's the first part. And then the second part that I think is maybe how I would put it is that it's not that the third term in the ternary case sort of encompasses the two terms, but it's that the relationship, because you have this more complicated ternary relationship, you have term A's relationship to term B and term A's relationship to term C, and then term B and C's relationship to each other. So you have all the different binary relations all sort of interacting with each other. Because of this, it allows for a certain stability, is how Simondon describes it. Universality in the sense that you because you have a certain a sort of external reference point. This third term serves as a sort of external reference point that you can share with another person, whereas this binary opposition of life and death or good mother and bad mother is sort of individual and less shareable. So yeah, this ternary structure allows for universalizability or shareability, at least with other people, in a way that the binary opposition does not. I think that's sort of how he sees this difference between the binary and ternary cases. But again, he wants to see this as a continuity from one to the other. So it's not a qualitative distinction. it's a sort of difference in degree of complexity from one to the other, and sort of the consequence of this complexity is this shareability between individuals that allows for something like a myth that can be common to it's not just one person's sort of individual conception of life and death, but it's a collective representation of how life and death work and what relation they have to life after death, for example, or eternal life. I think that's where he sees this difference between the binary and the ternary cases arising.
I wonder how I don't really have a coherent way to put this, but I wonder how the relation between the continuous terms in the binary image is related to the comments that he makes about the indefinite dyad in Individuation Volume 1. Maybe one way to think about it is one of the definitions of transduction is like the example of color vision, where a color is understood in its relation to I can't remember if it's the most intense or I think it's the most intense color, which I think was yellow-green. But maybe in the example of the imago from Lacan, there's a similar sort of transductive placement of like encounters with others in day-to-day life on this, I guess, good mother, bad mother spectrum that constitutes the binary symbol image.
Yeah, I think definitely related to this notion of a transductive spectrum, and so there's that bit where he talks about yellow-green light as like if I remember correctly, it's the frequency band that humans can distinguish most easily. Is that sort of middle of the spectrum, the yellow-green light. And then the whole spectrum is sort of splits out of that middle point. And this is sort of the typical Simondon move, where you start from the middle and then split the two opposed poles out of it. This is maybe slightly different in that we aren't starting from a sort of average mother and then splitting and finding a good and bad mother as two opposed poles. We have the two images of the good mother and the bad mother as the two poles of the spectrum, and then all of our other relationships are sort of finding a position somewhere in that spectrum. I wonder, I don't know if maybe he sees the good and bad mother as arising out of not an average mother, but like a more fundamental image of the mother that would be neither good nor bad, but out of which good and bad would arise. I'm not sure if he sort of makes that move here, but that would be sort of what we would expect. And then this role of the ternary, or the third term in the ternary process, I think we can maybe connect this to the disparation example in Individuation Volume 1. So like we have this opposition or this tension between the two opposed retinal images, and our way of sort of reconciling these two opposed images, or these images in tension with each other, is by introducing a third term, which is the depth, our perception of depth. So again, I think this process of symbolization, we should see it as a sort of development out of this primitive or original tension between the two terms of the binary opposition, and then the ternary structure would arise out of this binary structure through this sort of tension resolution process, comparable to a sort of invention. And we'll see more about invention in the next part of the book.
It kind of reminds me of Fichte's definition of the principle of sufficient reason. I can post it in the chat. That no two things are, I should say, posited, I think, posited in opposition to each other unless they are equivalent in some third thing. And no two things are equivalent unless they're posited in opposition to some third thing. I guess it would be interesting to think about the kind of, if there is a kind of lineage between this idea of a principle of equivalence in which two different things have to be posited, and Simondon's notion of disparation as individuation, discovery of the dimension that contains the two terms out of which it's individuated.
Yeah. It's hard to say because Simondon almost never talks about Fichte. Like there's a very brief mention, or I think maybe a couple paragraphs in History of the Notion of the Individual. But yeah, I think in Fichte, I think this third term, the third term in which the two opposite terms are equivalent, is logically poorer, is logically thinner, or has less content than the two opposed terms. So like if you have two opposed terms like steel and not steel, those two terms would be opposed to each other in relation to a third term like metal in general, and then not steel would be like all the other metals that are not steel. I think the sort of point of the logical point that Fichte is making here is that it doesn't really make sense to have a sort of opposition in general. Like if you just oppose steel and not steel, if you include under not steel like dogs and apples and the number 4 and like every other thing that is not steel, then it's like a completely empty concept. So it's only insofar as you are opposing within a determinate domain of existence that you can sort of have a determinate concept of not steel. Yes, but then in the opposition between the I and the not I, there's an absolute opposition, and so everything, all these other oppositions are always relative oppositions that sort of follow from this absolute opposition. And so I think in Simondon's concept of the sort of invention or discovery of depth perception through overcoming disparation, I think one of the key ideas for him is that this invention is not a sort of poorer, is not logically poorer or thinner than the two images. There's nothing is lost from when you pass from the two retinal images to the united depth perception. You sort of contain the final results of the invention contains all the content that was already in the two retinal images, and sort of unites it into a richer whole, as opposed to like sort of rising to a more general category like metal in general, in which steel and not steel would be opposed to each other. I think it's a sort of different logical move that Simondon was doing here, but I wonder if he, is explicitly thinking of this as, in opposition to Fichte's approach to, understanding these sort of oppositions and how they relate to a third term.
It seems like for Simondon, often you'll have these two extreme terms, as you've noted, and then you'll find that there is something. Simondon will show that there is a kind of internal relation between them in a concept that underlies them. I wonder if maybe one way to think of the difference between, like, I don't know if we could say the difference between like the inductive thinking, which becomes less rich as it moves upwards, and Simondon's discovery of a third term, which doesn't lose any richness, is a difference between like an external relation and an internal relation between the terms. But I know that's a bit general, and I don't know, maybe just something that we can like keep in mind and see if there's anything that he says that sheds light on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So for those who maybe don't know this sort of concept of internal versus external relations, so this has to do with actually, I think we may have talked about this before, but the idea is that most relation, like if we take the relation being taller than, this is obviously a completely extrinsic relationship. There's nothing about a particular person that there's nothing intrinsic about that person that determines whether that person is taller than another person. It's sort of irrelevant to that person's being, whether they happen to be taller than another person or not. Whereas another type of relation, like maybe is the father of, you might think that relationship is not a purely external relationship and a purely sort of arbitrary relationship between person A and person B. You might think being the father of X is actually part of what makes you who you are, or your essence or your being, whatever you want to call it. An internal relationship would be this kind of relationship that is constitutive of the entity that is one of the terms of the relationship. And we've seen throughout individuation that Simondon wants to have a conception of relation as having the status of being, and so this would be an internal relation as opposed to an external one. I think it probably does make sense to see his sort of move of finding this third term as itself a kind of internal relation between these terms, like a internal logical relation between concepts. So as opposed to an inductive approach that just sort of finds the common, the more general concept under which two concepts are subsumed. This would be an external relationship between concepts, and then the sort of finding that middle term out of which the two concepts can be generated in Simondon's approach would be an internal relationship between concepts. I think that's a helpful way of conceiving of the difference between these two sort of modes of reasoning. Okay, so we're maybe a little bit early, but we're at a section break here, so I'm going to suggest that we stop here for today and then pick up from subsection 2 next time, if that works for everyone.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. So thanks for coming out. I hope we can get a few more people to read next time, because it's better for the recording, I think, to have more different people involved. But thanks for attending. Thanks for your contributions, and hope to see everyone next week.
Thanks, Don. See you next week.